the 1st of July, 2019. A gray morning in lower Manhattan, the air thick with summer humidity that rolls off the Hudson like a slow exhale. Inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, federal marshals are moving a prisoner through a series of corridors most people will never see. He's 51 years old, 5'6". His hair has started to thin. His hands, the hands that once signed death warrants with a nod, that built tunnels under international borders, that controlled a criminal empire generating an estimated $3 billion a year, are cuffed behind his back. There are no cameras, no crowds, no one throwing flowers or shouting his name. The man who was once called El Señor, the man whose birthday was celebrated with gunfire in the mountains of Sinaloa, is transferred to a vehicle that looks like any other government transport. He has just been sentenced to life in federal prison plus 30 years. The judge told him he would never walk free again. He listened without visible emotion. What happened next, what happens every single day to Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera now, is a story that has never been told in full. Not because the information doesn't exist, but because the place where El Chapo now lives was specifically designed to keep the world from seeing inside it. How do you build a prison that can hold the unholdable? What does it do to a human mind to spend 23 hours a day in a space smaller than a parking spot? And what does it mean that the man who twice escaped maximum security Mexican facilities, tunnels, motorcycles, the whole mythology, now lives in a box he will never leave, in a country that built that box specifically for people like him? What you're about to discover in the next few minutes will completely reframe how you understand what American incarceration at its most extreme actually looks like. This is the story that court documents, human rights reports, and former inmate accounts make possible, and that almost nobody has assembled in one place until now. There is a place in the southern Rocky Mountains of Colorado, roughly 90 miles south of Denver, where the land flattens into a high desert plateau, and the wind comes through the San Isabel National Forest with the kind of cold that feels personal. The town of Florence, Colorado, has a population of around 3,700 people. It has a Dollar General, a few churches, a high school. It is, by most definitions, unremarkable. But Florence, Colorado also has more prisons per square mile than almost any other place in the United States. They call it the corrections capital of the world, a grim tourism slogan that the town's residents regard with complicated feelings. There are close to a dozen state and federal facilities within a short drive of downtown Florence. And sitting at the end of a long access road, behind multiple perimeter fences topped with razor wire, surrounded by motion detectors and armed watchtowers and land that offers nowhere to run even if you somehow got through all of it, is a facility known officially as the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum, Florence. Everyone who knows what it is calls it ADX. The people who built it have called it the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Former inmates have called it things that cannot be repeated in a documentary format. Robert Hood, who served as warden of ADX Florence for 3 years in the early 2000s, described it to the press with a precision that has never been improved upon. He said, "It is a clean version of hell." ADX Florence opened in November of 1994, and it was built to solve a specific problem. The federal government had concluded that there were certain prisoners, a small category of the most dangerous, most violent, most escape-prone, most destabilizing individuals in the entire American prison system, for whom standard maximum security was insufficient. These were people who had ordered murders from inside existing facilities, people who had organized escapes, people whose very presence in a general population created a gravitational pull toward chaos. The solution was a facility built not to punish in the traditional sense, not flogging, not sensory torture in the legally actionable sense, but to neutralize, to reduce a human being's capacity for external action to as close to zero as the law permitted. To hold a person in a state of such profound isolation that the question of what they might do to others becomes, in a practical sense, unanswerable. Because they are never near anyone long enough for the question to arise, it is a remarkable institution by any measure. And it is, as of the summer of 2019, the permanent home of the most famous drug trafficker in the history of the Western Hemisphere. But to understand what El Chapo's days actually look like, what he sees, what he hears, what his body and mind experience inside ADX Florence, we need to understand exactly what that facility was designed to do. And we need to understand something about the man himself that the mythology of El Chapo has consistently obscured. What was actually taken from him when those cell doors closed. Joaquin Guzman was born on the 4th of April, 1957, in a small village called La Tuna in the municipality of Badiraguato, in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Sinaloa. The house where he grew up had a dirt floor. His father, Emilio Guzman Bustillos, was a cattle rancher by description and an opium grower by practice, which in the Sinaloa highlands of the 1950s was a distinction without much difference. The mountains there had been producing opium for decades. It was the economy of the region the way wheat is the economy of Kansas. His formal education ended roughly at the 3rd grade. The mountains of Badiraguato were not a place where abstract futures presented themselves to children from poor families. What presented itself was the crop, the trade, and the hierarchy that had governed both for generations. Guzman entered that world as a teenager, running errands for local traffickers, learning the logistics of moving product through terrain that outsiders found impassable. He was quick, efficient, and reliable, qualities that, in any organizational context, attract attention from people who need things done. By his mid-20s, he was working directly under Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the man known as El Padrino, who ran the Guadalajara cartel, the dominant narco-trafficking organization in Mexico in the 1980s. Guzman proved to be something the Guadalajara cartel had in abundance, but rarely at his level: a logistics genius. He did not think of himself as a killer first. He thought of himself as a problem solver. Transportation problems, corruption problems, personnel problems. He approached them all with the same methodical efficiency. He built a tunnel under the United States-Mexico border at Agua Prieta, Arizona in 1990, a tunnel with ventilation, lighting, and rails for moving product. Before anyone on the law enforcement side had fully conceptualized that such a thing was possible. When Felix Gallardo was arrested in 1989 and the Guadalajara cartel fractured, Guzman emerged from the division as the leader of what would become the Sinaloa cartel, not immediately, not cleanly, but through a combination of strategic violence, alliance building, and the cultivation of a reputation that was as much fiction as fact. The fiction was important. El Chapo, the nickname means shorty in Mexican slang, a reference to his height, was a brand as much as a man. Stories circulated that he could not be killed, that he always knew when authorities were coming, that he had informants inside every government office that mattered. Some of these stories were true. The corruption was real and documented. His trial in the Eastern District of New York in 2018 and 2019 produced testimony that he paid a $250 million bribe to a former Mexican president, a figure that, if accurate, represents one of the largest single acts of institutional corruption in the recorded history of organized crime. The reach was real. The tunnels were real. The escapes from Puente Grande in 2001, from the Altiplano in 2015, were real, and they are central to understanding what ADX Florence represents for the American government. There is one detail in this story that divides everyone who has studied it. Was Joaquin Guzman a product of the Sierra Madre, a man whose path was so determined by poverty and geography that the concept of choice barely applied? Or was he someone who chose, at every available junction, to become exactly who he became? Keep that question in mind, because what happens to a man inside ADX Florence makes it impossible to avoid. Here is what the cell looks like, according to court filings, architectural records, and accounts from former inmates published in human rights organization reports over the past 2 decades. 7 feet wide, 12 feet long, 84 square feet of poured concrete. The walls are concrete. The floor is concrete. The ceiling, 9 feet overhead, is concrete. There is a single concrete slab that functions as a bed, a concrete desk, and a concrete stool, all formed as extensions of the wall. There is a shower in the cell, a combined toilet and sink unit, and a polished piece of steel bolted to the wall that functions as a mirror. The fixtures are controlled remotely by correctional officers. The water can be turned on and off from outside. The light, fluorescent, recessed behind shatterproof glass, is never fully extinguished, maintained at a low level through the night. There is a window. This is the detail that sounds like a concession until you understand what it means. The window is 4 inches wide. It is positioned to show a slice of sky and nothing else. No ground, no landscape, no human activity, no horizon. According to former ADX inmates interviewed by human rights organizations, including the American Civil Liberties Union and Amnesty International over the years, the window was engineered specifically to prevent prisoners from determining where within the facility their cell is located, which direction they are facing, or what time of day it is with any precision. The 4-inch window is less a concession to humanity than a precision instrument of disorientation. The door is steel. It has a narrow slot at the bottom, the food slot, through which all meals are delivered. When the door opens, which it does once a day for 1 hour of solitary recreation in a small outdoor cage, the prisoner steps directly from their cell into a hallway where they will not encounter another inmate. The outdoor cage is concrete on the floor and chain link on the walls and ceiling. It is sometimes described as a dog run. It is 30 feet long. It contains nothing. 23 hours in the cell, 1 hour in the cage, every day. No exceptions for weekends. No exceptions for holidays. Before we go any further, there is something you need to understand about this facility that changes the weight of everything you've just heard. ADX Florence holds, at any given time, between 300 and 450 inmates. It is not a large prison. It is not designed for scale. It was designed for a very specific purpose: to hold the fraction of 1% of the federal prison population deemed too dangerous, too disruptive, or too high profile for any other arrangement. Among its current and former residents, the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, who died there in 2023, Robert Hansen, the FBI agent who spied for the Soviet Union for over 2 decades, Zacharias Moussaoui, convicted in connection with the September the 11th attacks, Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the First World Trade Center bombing. It is not a collection of criminals. It is a collection of historical events given human form and placed in concrete boxes. El Chapo is in that collection now. And the question that is not being asked loudly enough is what, exactly, is happening to his mind? Up to this point, Joaquin Guzman had spent his entire adult life in motion. Let's be precise about what that means, because the contrast with what he experiences now is the central fact of this story. The Sinaloa cartel, at its operational peak in the early 2000s through the mid-2010s, controlled trafficking routes through 23 of Mexico's 31 states, according to U.S. government estimates presented at his trial. It maintained operations in more than 50 countries. It employed, the word is uncomfortable but accurate, tens of thousands of people, from farmers in the Sierra Madre to distributors in Chicago and New York, to officials at multiple levels of the Mexican government. Guzman himself, according to trial testimony, moved constantly. Safe houses in Culiacan, in Mazatlan, in the mountains. Properties registered under different names. Vehicles swapped routinely. Phones replaced after a single use. Movement was not just a security preference for Guzman. According to accounts from people who knew him and whose testimony was entered into the court record, he was a man of physical and social energy, someone who held parties, who maintained relationships simultaneously across multiple locations, who ate long meals with subordinates and family members, who loved corridos played loud, who rode horses in the mountains of Sinaloa when he could. His two escapes from Mexican prison are remembered as spectacular, precisely because they fit the mythology. The first, from Puente Grande in Jalisco in 2001, reportedly involved hiding in a laundry cart. The second, from the Altiplano Federal Prison in 2015, involved a mile-long tunnel equipped with a motorcycle on rails, built directly beneath his cell and completed without detection. The engineering alone required months of coordinated work, real-time communication with people inside the prison, and a level of organizational capacity that embarrassed the Mexican government profoundly. What people don't discuss often enough is what those escapes tell us about the man's relationship to confinement. He could not tolerate it. Every account of his time in Mexican facilities describes someone who immediately began working against the walls around him, not as an abstract project, but as an urgent, consuming priority. The cage was intolerable. Getting out was not a goal. It was a biological imperative. ADX Florence was built for exactly this psychology. It was not built to punish escapes after they happen. It was built to make escape structurally impossible from the first day. The walls of ADX are 4 feet of reinforced concrete. The doors are controlled electronically and cannot be manipulated from inside. There are no laundry carts. There are no maintenance tunnels beneath the cells. The entire facility was designed by an engineer named Robert Sherwood, and according to Bureau of Prisons documentation from the period of its construction, one of its primary design objectives was the elimination of the social and physical conditions that allow organized prison activity to take place. No congregate meals, no shared recreation, no common areas where a network can be built, information passed, relationships formed. The architecture itself is the security system. The man who built an empire on movement and connection now lives in a world where neither is possible. This is not an accident. This is the point. A typical day at ADX Florence begins, according to accounts compiled by journalist Daniel Jennis, who served time in the federal system and has written extensively about supermax conditions, and by former ADX inmates who have spoken to human rights organizations around 6 in the morning when the institutional lights shift from their nighttime setting to full fluorescence. There is no alarm. There is no announcement. There is light, and then there is more light. Breakfast arrives through the food slot in the door. The meals at ADX have been described in varying ways by former inmates: adequate in caloric terms, monotonous in every other sense. There is no cafeteria. There is no choice. A tray slides through a slot, and a person eats alone at a concrete desk in a room the size of a generous parking space. This happens 3 times a day, every day, in the same room, in the same position, in the same silence. There is a television in the cell. This is the detail most people find surprising. ADX inmates have access to a small television, approximately 12 inches, mounted high on the wall, bolted and enclosed behind shatterproof material, positioned so it can be seen from the bed but not reached. The programming is limited to a curated selection of channels, and according to court documents from lawsuits filed against the Bureau of Prisons by ADX inmates over the years, it does not include live news programming for the highest security designation inmates. There is also a radio. There are books available through a delivery system where inmates submit written requests. There is correspondence, written letters, reviewed and processed by staff, which can take weeks each way. Contact with the outside world is, by design, minimal and mediated. Phone calls for ADX inmates, particularly those in the Communications Management Unit or under Special Administrative Measures, known as SAMs, which restrict communication specifically for national security or organized crime concerns, are sharply limited, monitored in their entirety, and in some cases restricted to immediate families only. El Chapo is held under special administrative measures. What this means in practice is that his communications with the outside world are among the most restricted of any prisoner in the United States. Every letter he writes is read. Every call, if permitted, is recorded and reviewed. The people he can contact are limited by a specific list approved by the Department of Justice. The 1 hour of recreation, the dog run, happens sometime in the late morning or early afternoon, depending on the rotation. The inmate walks from the cell to the cage through a series of electrically controlled doors. They do not interact with staff beyond the bare mechanical minimum. Hands through the slot for cuffs, an escort through the corridor. In the cage, they are alone. The sky is visible through the chain-link ceiling. There is no equipment in the cage. There is nothing to do except walk 30 feet in one direction and then walk back. But here's the part of this story that the official descriptions don't capture. And it is the part that makes this genuinely disturbing. What comes next is the part that no major outlet has assembled clearly from the available evidence. The psychological literature on solitary confinement is not ambiguous. It is not a contested scientific question in the way that some politically charged research areas are contested. The data, accumulated across decades from facilities around the world and specifically from American supermax institutions, is consistent. Prolonged isolation in conditions like those at ADX produces measurable, documented neurological and psychological damage. The studies, from researchers at the University of Colorado, from the work of psychiatrist Stuart Gracian, who interviewed inmates at the Walpole State Prison in Massachusetts in the 1980s, and whose findings have been replicated across multiple jurisdictions, identify a specific syndrome: hypersensitivity to stimuli, perceptual distortions, cognitive impairment, difficulty with memory and concentration. In the most severe cases, hallucinations. Former ADX inmate Jack Powers, whose case was documented in a lawsuit against the Bureau of Prisons, cut off his own finger inside the facility. Another former inmate described cutting off part of his ear. The psychological deterioration documented in these cases, and in the American Civil Liberties Union's extensive litigation against ADX, is not what most people picture when they picture El Chapo in prison. most people picture justice. They do not picture what the human nervous system does when deprived of adequate social contact for years at a time. El Chapo has been at ADX Florence since 2019. He is, as of this recording, more than 5 years into an isolation that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture has stated constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment when applied indefinitely. The trial in the Eastern District of New York, which ran from November of 2018 through February of 2019 in a federal courthouse in Brooklyn, was one of the most remarkable criminal proceedings in recent American legal history. The government called more than 50 witnesses. Former cartel members testified about murders, bribes, and cocaine shipments measured in tons. An alleged bribe to a former Mexican president was described in open court with a specificity and a casualness that suggested to observers that the corruptibility of Mexican institutions was being treated as background noise rather than revelation. Throughout the proceedings, Guzman sat at the defense table in suits provided by his legal team. Dark suits, ties, the visual grammar of an American defendant, making the expected gestures toward legitimacy. He listened to testimony about his life through headphones connected to a Spanish interpreter. He passed notes to his attorneys. He did not testify. He showed, by the assessment of virtually every journalist and legal observer in the courtroom, a sustained, eerie composure. The composure was its own kind of mythology. People speculated about what it meant. Was he calculating? Was he truly unafraid? Was he, as some suggested, simply incapable of processing what was actually happening to him? What we know now, from the years since the verdict, tells a different story. The composure in the courtroom was, in retrospect, the last performance of a man who still existed in the world. The last time Joaquin Guzman occupied a space larger than 84 square feet, heard the ambient noise of a functioning institution, sat near other human beings for extended periods of time, wore clothes he had chosen. The myth collapse happened in a courtroom in Brooklyn, and almost nobody noticed it at the time. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 10 counts on the 12th of February, 2019. El Chapo sat still. Those who expected a reaction, a flinch, a gesture toward his wife, Emma Cornell Ispuro, who sat in the gallery, something, got nothing. And the nothing was misread. It was called stoicism. It was called the arrogance of a man who doesn't accept reality. But there's a more precise explanation, and it comes from the testimony of Dr. Sima Ahmad, a psychiatrist who examined Guzman prior to sentencing, in a context that was documented in court filings. It comes from the observations of his own defense attorneys, who noted in filings related to his conditions of confinement that their client's cognitive condition had been deteriorating since his transfer from Mexico. It comes from former ADX inmates who described the psychological process of arriving at a supermax facility as similar to what they can only describe as the mind shutting certain doors permanently. The man who arrived at ADX Florence was already a different person than the man who was arrested in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, on the 8th of January, 2016. Mexican detention, even in its harshest form, is not ADX. There were human beings around him. There was noise. There was the texture of institutional life. ADX removed all of that. His legal team, in motions filed with the court over the past several years, has described a man who struggles to maintain focus during legal consultations, who repeats himself, who has difficulty tracking the progress of his own legal proceedings, who experiences, according to their filings, which are public record, symptoms consistent with what the psychological literature on prolonged isolation identifies as cognitive degeneration attributable to confinement conditions. The myth of El Chapo, the genius escaper, the untouchable narco, the man who humiliated two governments, is dissolving not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a 7 by 12-foot room in the Colorado mountains, one day at a time, in silence. Let's remember exactly where we are in this story. A man who built one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in modern history is now in a facility specifically engineered to prevent him from being that person ever again. And what his attorneys are documenting in court filings is that the engineering is working, though perhaps not in the way the government intended. The legal fight over El Chapo's conditions of confinement is ongoing and has produced a body of documentation that is remarkable for its specificity. His attorneys have filed multiple motions challenging his special administrative measures, the SAMs, arguing that the restrictions on his communication are so severe that they violate his Sixth Amendment right to counsel and constitute conditions tantamount to torture under international human rights law. The government's responses, also part of the public record, argue that the SAMs are necessary because of the documented escape risk Guzman represents, and because his communications with the outside world could facilitate ongoing criminal activity by the Sinaloa cartel. Both of these arguments are simultaneously true and in tension with each other. The escape risk is real. The man built a mile-long tunnel under a Mexican prison. The concern about criminal facilitation is real. Multiple cartel leaders have run operations from prison in Mexico and other countries. And the psychological deterioration documented by his own attorneys is real. The studies on prolonged isolation don't have a carve-out for people who did terrible things. What the courts have done with this tension is, so far, very little. A lawsuit filed by El Chapo's legal team challenging his confinement conditions has proceeded slowly through the federal judiciary. The United Nations mechanisms that have commented on ADX conditions generally have no enforcement power over United States domestic policy. Congress has not, as of this recording, moved to legislate limits on the use of solitary confinement in federal facilities, though advocacy organizations, including the ACLU, have pushed for such legislation for years. The closed-loop revelation, the piece that closes one major thread of this story, is this: the man who twice embarrassed the United States government by proxy, by making the Mexican government look incapable of holding him, and who thereby created the political pressure for exactly this level of confinement, is now being held in a way that his own government's most credentialed psychiatrists acknowledge produces serious harm to the human mind. The United States built ADX Florence to solve the problem of people like Joaquin Guzman. And having placed him there, it now faces a version of the question it was trying to avoid. What does it mean to keep a human being in conditions that the medical consensus says are damaging to human beings, indefinitely, with no review mechanism and no end point? This is not a question about whether El Chapo deserves punishment. He was convicted by a jury of kidnapping, drug trafficking, and a conspiracy connected to murders. The families of people killed by the Sinaloa cartel, the people who lived in the communities where cartel violence was a daily condition of existence, the agents and police officers and journalists and civilians who were killed because they were in the way of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, those people deserve a reckoning. That is not in dispute. The question is a different one, and it does not have an easy answer. Emma Coronel Aispuro, El Chapo's wife, 23 years his junior, a former beauty queen from Durango who sat in the Brooklyn courtroom gallery throughout the trial in carefully chosen outfits that generated their own media coverage, was arrested at Dulles International Airport in Virginia on the 22nd of February, 2021. She pleaded guilty to charges of drug trafficking conspiracy and of helping to facilitate her husband's escape from the Altiplano prison in 2015. She was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and was released in September of 2023. She is now free. Her husband is not. Their daughters. El Chapo has children from multiple relationships across his life, but Emma Coronel bore him twin daughters, born in 2011 in a California hospital, while their father was a fugitive, are growing up in a world their father will never inhabit. The twin girls were 8 years old when El Chapo was arrested for the final time. They were 11 when he arrived at ADX. They are teenagers now. The communication between a father at ADX Florence under special administrative measures and his children outside is, per the SAM's documentation, severely restricted. The Sinaloa cartel itself, which is the other consequence this story demands we account for, has not dissolved in Guzman's absence. The organization fractured following his final arrest and the subsequent arrest and extradition of other senior figures, but it did not cease to exist. According to the Drug Enforcement Administration's most recent public assessments, Sinaloa-affiliated trafficking networks continue to operate across the United States, with fentanyl having replaced cocaine and heroin as the primary product in terms of volume and lethality. The fentanyl crisis, which has killed, by CDC estimates, over 70,000 Americans annually in recent years, is in part a product of trafficking networks whose infrastructure was built during the years when El Chapo was running the Sinaloa cartel. This is the real cost that the mythology of El Chapo consistently obscures. Not the escapes, not the bribes, not the tunnels and the corridos and the Sean Penn interview and the Netflix series. The real cost is the communities in Mexico, in the United States, across the transit countries, that absorbed the violence and the addiction and the institutional corruption that the enterprise required. The real cost is in overdose statistics and mass graves and journalists killed for reporting what was happening. Joaquin Guzman did not create the conditions that made the Sinaloa cartel possible. Poverty in the Sierra Madre predated him by generations. American demand for narcotics predated him. The corruption of Mexican institutions predated him. He was, in the language of social science, a vector, someone who took existing conditions and channeled them into a particular form at a particular scale. But he also made choices. Specific, documented, deliberate choices, many of which were entered into the court record in Brooklyn over the course of a 4-month trial. And those choices are what make the concrete cell in Colorado the specific cell it is. There is a particular kind of justice that works not through pain, but through irony, through the precise, uncommented reversal of everything a person built their life upon. Joaquin Guzman built his life on movement, on connection, on the particular power that comes from being simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, reachable by some and invisible to others. He built tunnels so that walls would mean nothing. He built networks so that isolation would be impossible. He built a mythology specifically designed to make confinement seem temporary, a condition that could be reversed by sufficient ingenuity and sufficient will. The cell at ADX Florence is the answer to all of it. Not a punishment designed around what he did to others, but a structure designed around exactly what he was. Every feature of the place is the negation of a feature of his life. The 4-inch window that shows only sky, the concrete fixtures that cannot be moved, organized, built upon. The food slot that makes human contact a managed exception rather than a condition of existence. The SAMs that ensure the network outside cannot reach the man inside. The real cost of what Joaquin Guzman built is not what happens to him in that cell. The real cost is measurable in obituaries and in overdose statistics, and in the stories of Mexican communities that spent decades living under the shadow of an organization that had purchased the institutions meant to protect them. That cost was real before he went to prison, and it continues after. Because the enterprise he built outlasted him the moment he was arrested. And the question that remains, the one with no clean answer, is this: what does a society learn about itself when it responds to documented human harm by creating conditions that the medical community identifies as causing documented human harm? When the punishment is calibrated not to what the person did, but to what the person was. When the cell is designed specifically to take a man's mind apart, not as a side effect but as a feature? El Chapo will die in ADX Florence. That is not a speculation. It is the mathematical conclusion of a life sentence plus 30 years. The man who built tunnels through the earth so that no wall could hold him will die in a box he never left. The question nobody has a good answer to is what that means. Not for him, but for the system that built the box and for the country that decided this was justice. What do you think? Was the sentence and the conditions at ADX the appropriate response to what Guzman built? Or does his documented psychological deterioration reveal something about the limits of what the American justice system is prepared to call acceptable? We'd genuinely like to know where you land on this. Leave your answer in the comments. If you stayed until the end of this, it's because this kind of story matters to you. The ones that don't stop at the verdict, that follow the story into the places it becomes uncomfortable. Subscribe so you don't miss what we put out next. A like tells us this work reaches people. Both of those things let us keep doing this. This is where the real stories live. The ones that keep going after the headlines stop.